On behalf of Albany Law School and the Government Law Center, I want to thank you all for coming this afternoon. I'm Alicia Ouellette. I'm the dean here at the law school. And we are delighted to co-sponsor and host today's panel discussion. Last night I was downtown and I went to a couple of places, and it was sort of remarkable because everyone was talking about this event, and it struck me that it's only in Albany where something about the balance of powers between the legislative branch and the executive branch would be all the buzz. And we are either really truly a government town or a town that's really thick and rich with policy geeks. And it may be a little bit of both. We hope that today's program, and we know that today's program is going to be interesting and fascinating to all of you. It has been almost 50 years since the last Constitutional Convention was held in New York State. With a 2017 vote for a Constitutional Convention just 2 years away, today's program is an opportunity to think about how we got to the place where we are today, and to debate what might be in the best interests of the future of our government and our citizens. I'd like to recognize the Rockefeller Institute for conceiving this program and taking the lead in designing it and assembling a who's who. I mean, this is such an esteemed panel, a who's who of incredible leaders who have devoted much of their careers to making New York State's government work. Albany Law has partnered with the Rockefeller Institute on several successful programs aimed at improving the function of the government, and it's always our pleasure to do so, and today's event is no exception. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge the dedication of Bob Bullock. Bob Bullock was instrumental in putting together today's superb program and speakers. This is the first of what we envision being a series of constitutional conversations over the coming years leading to the vote on the convention. You know, judging from the lineup that we have and the crowd who has appeared, we know that we're in for an incredible series. Bob, this is going to be a tough one to top. You got your work cut out for you. I'd also like to just take a minute to acknowledge our home team, Albany Law School's Government Law Center. The GLC is the pride of the law school. Many of you have been engaged with the Government Law Center for a long time. You knew our former leader, Patty Sulkin. There was some worry when Patty left us that the GLC would falter. How wrong that worry was. When Patty left, we hit the ground running with an incredible new leader. Our director, Professor Ray Brescia, has taken us to places that we hadn't even imagined. Under his leadership, we have collaborative programs like today's. We're also looking at new areas for us, racing and gaming law, urban development and smart cities, entrepreneurship, the startup economy, so much more. We are grateful for Ray's leadership, and especially for his work in putting together today's program. We also know that no leader works alone. Ray has a great team. I won't mention all of them, but there are two members of the team that made special contributions to make today happen. Those two people are Lisa Ravitch and Amy Gunnels. You join me in thanking Lisa and Amy for all their work in putting today together. Thank you. Turning to today's conversation, we are particularly pleased that the panel will be moderated by Hank Greenberg. Hank is a former assistant U.S. attorney. He was counsel to the Attorney General. He was general counsel to the New York State Department of Health, and he was a law clerk to the Honorable Judith S.K. of the Court of Appeals. He will introduce the speakers, the panelists throughout today, and moderate the discussion. But first, I have the distinct honor of introducing today's keynote speaker, former New York State Governor David Paterson. Governor Paterson was elected to represent Harlem at the age of 31, making him the youngest state senator in New York history. He served 22 years in the state Senate, Elected by the Democratic caucus as minority leader in 2002, becoming at the time the highest-ranking African-American elected official in the history of the state. He made history again when he was elected lieutenant governor in 2007 and assumed the governorship just a year later. Governor Paterson sounded an early alarm about the impact of the financial crisis of 2008 on the state's finances. In 2010, Governor Paterson pioneered a new and bold precedent, shifting the balance of powers between the legislature and the governor on negotiating the budget. His budget extender strategy, coupled with the Court of Appeals decision in 2004 and a public referendum that upheld the governor's authority, have changed the budget process in New York. Since leaving office, Governor Paterson sits on the board of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority and is a frequent guest commentator on political topics. In 2014, Governor Cuomo appointed him to serve as chair of the New York State Democratic Party. This March, as his portrait was unveiled in the Capitol's Hall of Governors, Governor Paterson drew praise from Governor Cuomo and other leaders for shepherding the state through a period of financial turmoil and for serving as a role model for African American and people with disabilities. We're thrilled, Governor Paterson, that you are here today to share your distinct perspective on the governor's use of budget authority. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker, former Governor David Paterson.
Before today, the only thing that anyone remembered about me being governor is that I appeared on Saturday Night Live. So let me begin by saying good afternoon. I'm David Paterson, and all of you should be so happy that you're not. I want to thank Dean Ouellette for that very kind introduction. I would like to point out, Dean, that before I get hauled before another ethics committee, I resigned from the MTA when I was appointed the chair of the state party, in case any of you who like to report on these things want to go check it out. And I cannot tell you how excited I am about the Rockefeller Institute and Bob Bullock and Tom Bayes and everyone else who brought us here today, and their efforts, hopefully, that we might see another constitutional convention in New York, because I really think that there are so many changes in law and in incidental situations since 1967, when there last was one, that I would welcome the opportunity to see some hardworking men and women craft some addendums to our current Constitution. So with that, somebody once told me that budgeting is all about the politics of governing, the making of choices, the setting of priorities. And as Hans Morgenthau once observed, politics is the struggle for power. These truths hold up in the harshest of times as well as the best of times. I governed New York during one of the three most difficult economic periods that the state ever had to address. And in that respect, it gave me a unique perspective on the case Silver v. Pataki, which is our topic for discussion this afternoon. Now, if you don't know anything about Silver versus Pataki, after this colloquia, I'm sure that you may know less. But in all seriousness, the Institute has assembled quite an enlightened cadre of budget directors, of lawyers, of legislators, of judges, and also of scholars who will give us a perspective on Silver v. Pataki as we move forward in governance here in New York State. Silver v. Pataki really is the struggle of the allocation of power. But in my view, it also involves context, and it also involves circumstances. The effect of context and circumstances as they impinge upon the concept of law is so difficult because there are so many variable situations that it's been hard to measure the relationship between the legislative and executive branches over the years. But I think we are finally coming to some kind of consensus. Silver v. Pataki is a seminal decision, but it is also an existential one. And as you listen to the discussions today, I would advise that you not ascribe it with a precise definition. Please remember the context. Please consider the consequences. The plurality decision in this case is shrouded in vagary, and so will much of today's discussion. Decided in 2004, Silver versus Pataki analyzes the actions of the governor and the legislature during the period from 1998 to 2001. I was in the Senate in 1998 and 2001 and had become the minority leader when the opinion was rendered in 2004. Interestingly enough, in 2005, as a state senator, I voted for a constitutional resolution that actually would have reversed Silver v. Pataki. It was known as Proposition 1. It was resoundingly defeated 2-1. So now, the court spoke in 2004, and the people spoke in 2005. And I heeded that call. But I wouldn't understand it as well until coincidence and some circumstances occurred in 2008 that landed me as the 55th governor of the state of New York. Now, we're not going to devote any time here today to what the circumstances were that caused me to become governor, other than to say that it was the best benefit I ever got from sex, and I wasn't even there. Well, where were we? I actually grew to approve of Silver v. Pataki, and I submit that all of you, including former Assemblyman Brodsky, would if they had become governor at the time that I did. There was a nationwide movement in the early part of the 20th century to try to reform law and institute executive budgeting. In its barest sense, executive budgeting just shifts the initiative from the legislature to the executive. Our society developed as colonialists and then became revolutionaries. Americans had a very suspicious eye on a great deal of power being consumed by one person. But in 1915, Warren Stimson, who went on to greater valor, wrote a memorandum advancing the idea of executive budgeting in New York. It was turned down by New Yorkers in 1916, but finally ratified in 1926 under Governor Al Smith. And New York went even a little beyond where the rest of the country did at that particular time. It designated 3 commissioners, the commissioners of banking and insurance and of law enforcement, changing their titles to superintendent and extending their terms from 4 to 5 years, because even though they wanted those positions to be independent from gubernatorial supervision, they still were championing the idea of strong leadership from the executive levels. What had happened was that previously the initiative was given to the legislature, and it found itself to be something that was insufficient. Legislators govern in a particular district. Agencies of the state report to the governor. It is the governor's role to implement the budget. So when the switch occurred, now through executive budgeting, the agency heads would come up with their funding requests for the next year and give them to the governor, who would review and revise and prioritize them and send them back to the legislature in the form of a budget bill. The governor now had the initiative. Now, almost everybody knows that a budget is really a pile of appropriations bills. In a New York budget, the legislature can accept the governor's budget or reduce the spending in the bills or set it aside and create their own appropriations bills. If the legislature chooses to submit its own budget, the governor can accept that budget or line item veto it. So the first point I really want to make is that I think that the legislature has great power in the process right now. Let's think about it for a minute. If you had a $150 million appropriation offered through the executive, the legislature could cut it by 50%. Now you have a $75 million appropriation, and the governor can do nothing about it. The legislature also has the option of overriding the governor's vetoes, as it did in 2003, 119 times to Governor Pataki. Now, here on Planet Albany, we have a budget process where routinely the governor issues the budget, the legislature sets it aside, and that compels negotiation. One of the unfortunate byproducts of this type of negotiation may often be that it delays the process. From the early 1980s, the process got delayed a lot. From 1983 to 1995 to 2005, 22 straight years, the budget was passed after the fiscal year had expired. One year, in 2004, the budget went to August 11th, 33 days after the constitutional deadline. Enter Governor George Pataki. In 1998 and in 2001, he would issue in his appropriations language of policy, which would change the whole equation. Immediately, the legislature, I among them, objected. We said to the governor, hey, you can't do that. You're not budgeting. You're legislating. And now you're trampling on our constitutional territory. Each side sued the other. Each accused the other of not acting in compliance with the Constitution. And the court in 2004 rendered a decision in favor of the governor. Now, then in 2008, I take office. And Bob Bullock was nice enough to pick me up from the train station yesterday. And I was telling him about some of the things that happened, and I think I'll share it with you. I was sworn in 2 weeks before we had to pass a budget that included $7.5 million of cuts. In the beginning of April, right after the budget was passed, my budget director showed me the taxes that were paid by the 40 largest corporations and banks in the fourth quarter of 2006, and it was $531 million. Then she showed me that those same 40 corporations in the fourth quarter of 2007 paid only $72 million, 14% of what they had paid just a year earlier. In July of 2008, I would learn that the 16 largest banks paid $173 million into the New York State Treasury in 2007. In 2008, in June, they paid $5 million. That was 3% of what they paid before. The state was going off the cliff. And I then asked for time from the media to address the state to tell them that we had a problem. A woman called me up and said to me, first of all, you didn't get elected governor. You know how you became governor. And secondly, who are you to start not only lecturing the state, but like the whole country, like you think you're the president or something? That was my mother that placed that call. But I forged ahead anyway and tried to enlighten the state that we were in the worst recession since the Great Depression, and that since 22.5% of New York's revenues were derived from Wall Street profits, that we would be hurt more than any other state. The second highest was New Jersey with 9%. And so the legislature, who I've never given enough credit to, came back in August of 2008 and cut $1.6 billion of spending, and many of them came back from vacations, many of them came back from campaigns, but they did it, and we thought we had done something. But the budget projection for 2009, 2010, at that time was about $5 billion. We thought it would grow to $10 billion. By October, it was $12 billion. By January, it was $15 billion. By the time we passed the budget in 2009, we had to close a budget gap of $21.1 billion. That was the highest escalation of a budget deficit experienced by a state in the history of this country. And at the end of that process was the end of the patience of the legislators. They would not come back and close an out-year gap in 2009, even when the comptroller advised us on New Year's Eve that the state was broke. They didn't come back to fix anything. And in the beginning of 2009, when we owed money and were being sued by those who the state owed, the legislature still eschewed the opportunity to close the budget. So, acting on what we thought was the view of executive budgeting as posed by the New York State Court of Appeals in 2004, I put a lot of policy language that compelled cuts and other ways to try to trim costs in the 2010-2011 budget. The legislature laid it aside, negotiations were fruitless, the fiscal year expired, and further negotiations were equally ineffective. At that point, my counsel, Peter Kiernan, who you will hear from later today, and my budget director, Robert Megner, who also served Governor Cuomo, advised me that I could put policy language in the extenders. And the difference between the extenders and the regular budget process is now the legislature could only vote up or down on my proposal. They could either accept my request or shut the government down. So I did it over a period of 10 weeks, trying to compel negotiations, but the budget was passed. Ultimately, we felt that the effect of the Silver v. Pataki case was that the governor had to take action in these times, and that's what we did. Interestingly enough, it certainly would make one feel that both of the plurality decisions, both iterations of it, and the dissenting opinion in Silver v. Pataki suggested and really recognized that gubernatorial power, especially by way of this particular decision, this particular interpretation, was susceptible to abuse. I maintain that that has not happened as yet, and that it's not likely to happen. The primary rationale for the concept of executive budgeting is that there can be a concentration of power that would enable rapid decision-making in times of crisis. 2010 demonstrated those circumstances were a time of crisis. The legislature is not acting, and the state has gone broke, and therefore action had to be taken, and I acted. Now, the concentration of power at the same time also allocates a sense of accountability. In executive budgeting, the governor is accountable. This exposes the governor, as it did, to political difficulty arising from perhaps macroeconomic events such as a recession or high unemployment. As much as I think I was in a denial, after the first few months of my service, I knew that I would not be returning as governor of this state. There were going to be nearly $40 billion in cuts. There were going to be taxes against a proletariat that had already been overtaxed, and all that adds up to trouble for whoever does it. It's good to be a unifier, but sometimes when you're a unifier, you've unified everyone because they hate you. And yet, in the allocation of accountability in 2010, there had to be accountability, albeit perhaps that it was painful for one person, but still the state did not become insolvent. Now, in the issue, as far as the issue as policymaking, there have to be limitations. And Judge Smith avers in his plurality decision that although there will be delays caused by executive budgeting, inevitably a political solution will prevail. And that was what I felt very deeply is the reason why we don't have to be really concerned or worry much about what may be abuses of the gubernatorial power in these situations. And I suggest that the budgets between 2010 and 2015 bear that out. In 2010, I had a lot of policy ideas for the state. One was called SUNY 2020. I wanted to establish 4 institutions of higher learning in the state where the best and the brightest, the most gifted and talented young people from New York and all over the world would migrate. We wanted to have what they call the obesity tax. We wanted to allow supermarkets to sell wine like they do in 45 other states. By this time, the legislature is reeling from inactivity. They are unable to do anything about my budget extenders. All of these programs had significant spending and revenue allocations, so I could have put them in the extenders, but I didn't. And why didn't I? Because at that time, politically, none of these issues were ripe for that kind of activity, and I did not want to confuse the moral high ground of trying to keep the state out of duress with my own particular issues that I wanted to implement. And so I didn't do it. Governor Cuomo comes in 2011 with a tremendous plurality and a lot of political opportunity. He linked many of his policies in appropriations and even suggested on one occasion that he would link major policy changes to one single extender if the budget wasn't passed on time. The media affectionately called it the nuclear option. But the nuclear option was never needed because the governor compelled negotiation and has now passed 5 straight budgets here in New York State. We haven't had 5 straight budgets passed since the Peloponnesian Wars. So, interestingly enough, this year the governor had a new perspective. He has some policy changes he wants to make in the area of education reform and teacher evaluations. But somehow they didn't make it into the final cut of the governor's appropriations. Now, I don't know why he did that, but what I assume, he feels the timing isn't right, and he's not going to confuse the issue of budgeting with the issue of policymaking. In other words, he, like each governor before him since Silver v. Pataki, hears the ring of that decision in the hallowed walls of the Capitol. So, to end, I think I would just say that the issue of executive budgeting really allocates power. It does not enhance it. Politics does, and so do a lot of other things, circumstances. But the only thing that was shifted in this decision was the right of entry. In other words, that now the governor is the initiator of the budget. The full use of executive power may become very important in times of stress and economic hardship, as it did from 2008 to 2012. But those types of exhibitions of power are probably largely unnecessary in periods such as there is an improved economic condition. So in my opinion, the use of executive budgeting has really balanced the legislative powers and the executive powers across that fulcrum. Now, that fulcrum can be dislodged sometimes, maybe because of improper campaign finance structures or corrupt practices, or maybe even an inattentive public. But it will not be dislodged, in my opinion, due to Silver v. Pataki, and I thank you so much for inviting me to speak before you this afternoon.